You're listening to the Sticks in the Six podcast. Here are your co-hosts, Andrew Forbes, Peter Barachini, and Alex Hobson.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 116 of Sticks in the Six, brought to you by the folks at Indie Ale House. As always, I'm your host, Andrew Forbes, here with one of my co-hosts, Peter Barachini, without Alex Hobson once again this week, but we're very excited to bring on a special guest in Adam Proteau, who will join us shortly for this episode of the show. Peter, before we get into Leaf talk, post-deadline, post-game here against the Vancouver Canucks, obviously, how's it going this week, buddy?
Oh man, week is going great. Aside from that game, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of slow, but at the same time, it kind of picked up. It was very interesting with the deadline moves, everything, and then all of a sudden, we just get hammered with this massive snowstorm. So, I hope everything is great at your end because we got pretty hammered in my neck of the woods. And I'm just going to say this, the whole snow plowing situation was just awful in Toronto. I will say that. Not fun. I'm just going to leave it at that. But hopefully this is the last major snowfall because I've just had it. I'm done with storms. I'm done with the snow. I've had a bad experience. You know of that with my story at Christmas.
Stuck on a train for however many hours.
For a good 17 hours. Yeah. So I hope that this is the end of winter, hopefully. And that way the good spring, summer weather could come because I'm actually looking forward to that. How are you doing, man?
Yeah, I know we got the same kind of weather up here or down here, I guess, in London. Did a little bit of the shoveling today, but got a little help from my 2.5-year-old. So that was it's always nice to get him out and get him going. But yeah, same idea. It was really into what was going on with our Leafs prior to the deadline. Obviously, a little bit of a slow day for them come deadline. I think the whole day was fairly slow. A couple of minor moves, but it hasn't seemed like the same Leafs as of yet post deadline. And we kind of talked about that with the Boston Bruins in terms of seeing where they're going to be at post deadline with chemistry and how it might affect the team. I think we're seeing a little bit of that with the Maple Leafs now. But this is going to be a straight episode of just Leaf talk. And with that, I think we should bring in our guest now, Adam Proteau. Interview brought to you by the folks at Indie Ale House. Welcome to the show, Adam Proteau.
Hey, fellas.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Once again, we are joined by Adam Proteau from the Hockey News. Adam, we're just going to get started off before we get into our interview. How are you doing? And I hope that Maple Leafs loss really doesn't affect our conversation with everything that we're going to be doing. So
no, I'm happy to come on. Thanks for having me. And I'm kind of between both of you guys. I'm in Guelph right now. So it's, we got a pretty bad dumping of snow too. And I'm sick of it, but my birthday's in mid-April and I every year I always get used to we get the better teasing of the weather. Mm-hmm. You get another kick in the junk, mid-April time, and you're reminded that you live in Canada. So just happened to be on, and it's just too bad. It was a crummy game to watch from a Leaf fan perspective.
Quickly on the weather, it's kind of crazy though. Like we were teased all winter that it was going to be one of those, get maybe one dumping and that was it. And then, like you said, it's that little flash before we get into the springtime where it's just a quick kick in the nuts and that's it.
That's right. It just hurts that much more.
Yeah.
Again, hoping that the weather is going to be great from here on out. And as we get into our conversation about the Maple Leafs, we're not going to talk about the game because social media is just a place right now. Everyone is thinking worst case scenario. Let's talk about the positives. And obviously the big news was the Maple Leafs trade deadline, how they brought in Ryan O'Reilly. Again, everyone's focusing on worst case scenario with his hand right now. Noel Chari, Jake McCabe, Sam Lafferty, Luke Schenn. We could go in depth on all the deals, but based on everything that they made, Adam, what are your thoughts? And should everything play out if everyone is healthy? Is this enough for the Maple Leafs for the playoffs and to possibly get past the first round?
Well, guys, I think it could be. I mean, you can see the gambles that Kyle Dubas has made. Clearly, he's gambled on goaltending going into the season. He had his kind of insurance policy going, and I had talked to a couple of people throughout the league that really thought that they might make another move for a guy like James Reimer or somebody that at least had some footing in this market, that had played more games than a guy like maybe Joseph Woll. 7 games of NHL experience. If they have to turn to him, they could be in big trouble. And that's not a comment against Wall necessarily, more about the other 2 guys. But, I think Kyle did a pretty good job, all things considered. He's given his coach what he likes the most, and that's options, right? I mean, that's Sheldon Keefe talks about that pretty consistently, about having that consistency and having that competition for jobs. And now he's really, really got that, especially on the defensive end. I think it's going to be very fascinating to watch them experiment with pairings. And, again, it was a rough night for, a guy like Morgan Rielly tonight. Hard to defend some of the decisions he was making out there. But I don't expect him to be, healthy scratched, like somebody else on the team might be. But they do have options. And I guess it's just going to be about health. And, Ryan O'Reilly's injury didn't look too promising. When you don't hear anything after a guy leaves the game, that's a worrisome sign, I think. So, it's going to come down to the goaltending for me. I think, I did tune into the Winnipeg Edmonton game. I don't know if you guys caught any of that, but there's poor old Jack Campbell, super nice dude. Not always the most consistent goalie, and really deflating, I think, when you've got a talent like Connor McDavid and Draisaitl, who was unbelievable tonight. That backhanded goal was just a thing of beauty. But when you have a goalie, it's so deflating. You can see it in the body language of guys. You can see it in the faces. They try not to let it show because they know they're all under great scrutiny, everything they do. But you can't help but be let down when your goalie isn't there for you. And you can't really say that about Matt Murray tonight. He was pretty good. I mean, all things considered, he got hung up to dry a lot of times by bad decisions, and that offense. I mean, they just seem to play down to the level of competition sometimes. So, that in a way, it's almost a backhanded compliment to say that, because, if they get to the playoffs against a team like Tampa Bay, maybe they will play up to their level. But, when you look at the way the season may go and home ice advantage, these are the type of games that you lose that kill you. 5, games against Arizona, games against Montreal. They've just looked flat and kind of uninspired, as if they think, the game's going to come to them very easily, and it just doesn't, the way the NHL's played nowadays. So it's, the pain is there, and I think Sheldon Keefe's job, right now is to find a way to to get that consistency back. Even at this, after that first lull at the start of the season, they were on a pretty good tear. That built them up into the position they're in the standings. And I still think they can get back to that, but it's going to take a lot harder work than they showed against Vancouver.
I will say, anytime I see Jack Campbell in net for the Oilers, I take the over. So I was all over the over tonight. But getting back to the Leafs, I'm glad you kind of mentioned it with the healthy scratch, and these guys know on the show that I'm not a huge Morgan Rielly advocate when it comes to having him in a number 1 spot. For me, he's more of a 2-3 guy. One guy that's impressed me since coming up last year and playing with Giordano was Timothy Liljegren. And now he's been scratched for 2 straight games. Obviously, we knew that was going to kind of happen with the moves that were made, the defenseman that came in. But like, what are you seeing from these decisions? Like, is Liljegren a guy that maybe we should see in the lineup more often? He seems to be, for me anyways, a guy that kind of fits into a bit of a better role all around game in terms of his play versus somebody like Rielly.
Yeah, well, I think, Liljegren, to me, he has shown improvement this year. I think there's no question, his game all around is good. And he's one of those guys where you don't necessarily need him to lead the offense, right? I mean, they've got guys that should be contributing offense up front and not relying on a guy like Liljegren. But I like to see him when you really don't notice him, when he just plays that kind of patient, smart, sound decisions, good first ice passes up the ice. He can do that when he's at his best, and I think he's probably the easier guy to scratch because of his youth and because of his lack of experience. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best decision for down the road guys, because as we know, 3 or 4 of these defensemen that are on the team now are not going to be back next year. Justin Holl's not going to be re-signing. Gustafson's probably not going to be re-signing. Jordy Benn's probably not going to be around as a depth guy. So, you're going to be turning to him, to Liljegren, I think, more so next season. And knowing that he's a big part of your plan down the road, you would think that they might show a little more belief in him. But clearly with the Sandin trade too, I mean, 3 assists in his first game with Washington. I'm happy for him, and another really nice guy. But you can see where the Leafs' patience kind of reaches its end with some of these young guys, and how GMs and coaches tend to lean on guys. Even again, I'm not the biggest Justin Holl fan in the world, but he's played a pretty decent game this year. So I think when it comes down to it, who do you sit out? Do you give Mark Giordano a little bit of a rest? He's another guy. I like his game a lot, but do you really want to wear him down and not have him at his best at the start of the season? I think Liljegren can come in there and be a more regular player, to your point, Andrew, and to give them that support so that they're not taxing everybody overly.
And we understand why Dubas moved on from Liljegren. There was a logjam, especially on the left-hand side. And then again, you brought in a left-handed shot in Erik Gustafsson. But at the same time, it was hard for him to try and move up in the lineup. It was easier for Liljegren because they do need a right-handed shot. And you do see that progression throughout his game, through his time with the Marlies. You saw that obviously he was a bit more offensive-minded back then, but has developed that two-way game. Do you think that, obviously he could be a bit more of an important factor coming into the playoffs rather than Justin Holl? As we saw, he's had his moments, but then again, his decision making isn't quite there compared to Liljegren's, where it's a little bit more refined. And even today, the first goal from Andrei Kuzmenko's goal, he attempts to block a shot, goes off him, and then obviously blocks Matt Murray's vision as well. So where do you see the line about how the Maple Leafs should go about giving their younger players more minutes and letting their older players or veterans kind of take a back seat, even though they're not playing up to standard?
Well, that's a good question, Peter. I think, there has to be some type of balance, obviously, right? You can't, if you start sitting out veterans for long stretches, there's going to be, a media firestorm very, very quickly around the team. And that will be a storyline in a big way. But at the same time, to your point again, Liljegren to me is somebody who, his game has grown incrementally. There might have been bigger expectations on him in previous years. And I think people have just seen that's kind of slow but steady improvement in his game that makes us feel more comfortable with him, I think, as fans or as media, that he can go out there and do a good job. Justin Holl, I think, and again, I know he's a favorite of Sheldon Keefe, obviously, to keep him around, I think was a bit of a shocker to me. Only because I thought they could have improved their forward depth with trading him and maybe getting some cap money back that they could have used for another body. But if he's comfortable, if Keith is more comfortable with Hull, then so be it. But again, have that balance there so that it's not the same guy sitting out every night. I don't think Timothy Liljegren's done anything wrong to be out of the lineup. I mean, that's the bottom line. He hasn't suffered. I think. Again, you could probably make a bigger case that Morgan Riley has struggled since he's returned. And I think to Andrew's point, he's clearly not a number one defenseman. He's not ever going to win the Norris Trophy. He's not ever going to be a first-team All-Star. To me, he's again one of those guys that you just want to see a patient, solid game from him with a high panic threshold. And to me, that's what you've seen from Liljegren this year's. His panic threshold is pretty good now that that's competitive and you don't feel like the guy's just going to be overwhelmed mentally or terrorized. You can kind of see that sometimes with young defensemen, and I don't think you see that anymore with Liljegren. You might have seen that in his initial years, but that's normal. I think it's you very rarely see guys come into the league prepared, for the speed and the skill and the precision. And every time you talk to an AHL player and you ask them what the difference is, they tell you it's precision. It's making that perfect pass. It's always finding, the right look and the right feed. And I think Liljegren's been much better than that. So I do think you have to give him credit. I do think he's earned some more landing room to kind of try and stick the landing the rest of the season. And it's incumbent on Sheldon Keefe now to just find that balance.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Sheldon Keefe. It's down to him. Dubas has gone out and done his job. He's gotten exactly what Leafs Nation was asking for in that depth forward and some toughness on D. Obviously, the goaltending is a question mark, as you mentioned earlier. But you're seeing a little bit more of that flip flopping up front. Marner back up on the top line. You're seeing Nylander drop down again. Things seem to have gone well when Nylander was playing next to Matthews. Is this something that is just trying to see if they can get all the lines clicking, or are we going to be seeing Nylander make that jump to the top line again, you think?
I do think that's probably going to be the case, Andrew. I think, the experimenting is probably going to continue with the forwards. I mean, dropping Ryan O'Reilly back to third line center, they want to have a look at that. They want to have, Michael Bunting moving around a little bit and see if he can have some of his jam, kind of spread out around the lineup. And again, I do think there's more. I wrote about the Leafs for Full Press, and I said, to me, the experimenting, the majority of the experimenting is going to happen on defense, but the forwards, they're gonna have different looks too, and whether that's spurred on when Matt Nyes signs a contract and they try and squeeze him in for a few games. I think that's certainly up for debate. Whether they should do that, I don't know, but I think the feeling in the organization obviously is this is a guy that they want to give a shot to. So, your point about a Nylander, I think he and Marner sometimes in games like this, that if they're not the best players on the ice, it's hard for the rest of the team to make up for it. And I know John Tavares got blown up real good by that borderline Tyler Myers hit, but they do need their best players to be their best players, and they're not different than any team in that regard. So when you have a night where some guys are a little less visible than they are at their best, it puts a lot more pressure on the guys around them to make up for the scoring. And against the Canucks, that scoring clearly wasn't there.
Yeah, just to follow up, what were your thoughts on the hit, but McCabe coming in afterwards and just, I mean, obviously new to the team, standing up for his captain right off the hop there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it was out and out dirty. I don't think Tyler Myers is a dirty player. But I think, anytime, this is just the state of the modern day NHL, right? Where any type of hit like that will draw some type of reaction. And if you don't have somebody jumping in there, earlier in the season, it probably would have been Wayne Simmons, doing something like that. But, teams feel like they have to answer for it and stick up for their guys. And I guess that's a good thing. I just don't know that. Again, for me, anytime you get yourself into a fight, you endanger your hands, right? I mean, that's the bare minimum of what you're putting in jeopardy is the rest of your season if you screw up and get hurt. So I don't always agree that has to be the response, but I can see why Jake McCabe would do it. I mean, he wants to make a good impression. He's out with a new group of guys. He wants to show them that he's playing for them now and he's with them now. So, I understand psychologically what goes into it. I just think, showing a little bit more discipline and just making them pay, by scoring on them is a lot more effective than necessarily throwing down.
Yeah, I just want to touch up on McCabe and even Luke Schenn for that matter, because they set the tone early in this game. And even in the game against Calgary, McCabe was very noticeable in terms of his physicality, stepping up, but both players making a hit to not necessarily for the sake of making a hit and getting caught out of position, but they were very timely and precise hits that was at the right moment at the right time. What is this kind of newfound mentality? And even McCabe stepping up, as both you and Andrew were talking about before, stepping up for Tavares after that hit. What does this do for creating a new type of mentality that this team is not going to be pushed around, that they can keep up, strength-wise with the Tampa Bays, with the Boston Bruins, should that moment come, depending on what happens in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's definitely in their minds, right? They know as well as anybody what the public perception is of them and what they've earned, in people's mind is that skepticism, that they're going to be there for each other. So, I think when you see Tampa Bay acquired, I always forget how to pronounce his name, Gino. Yeah. I mean, those are the type of guys that are going to make those physical pushes and just to test you out, I think, and see what you do in response. So, that's why I think they went out and got a guy like Lafferty. He's pretty unflappable. I don't think he does anything just off the top of his head. He's not a hothead, but he is a physical player. And same with Ryan O'Reilly. Obviously, he's somebody that knows how to, to turn it up a little bit and play under pressure and play a physical game. And that really is the difference, I think, between this year's Leafs and last year's, even with Yarncroc. I mean, the guys that they brought in, they all kind of brought them in with this mentality of we got to be tougher. We got to be more resilient. We got to be ready to kind of answer the bell physically. And that doesn't necessarily mean fighting every game, but it does mean, having that edge and, maybe not being the most liked guys on the ice every night. Sometimes that's hard for guys, I think, to get past, especially young guys when they're trying to just fit into the league. They don't want to get a reputation as being a goof or a hothead or anything like that. So, that's the balance, I think, is just to try and find the difference between, being, not receptive, but being more willing to take that physical edge right back to a team when they get in your face. And I think, unfortunately, again, the game in Vancouver is probably just a bad example because they did, they just weren't as disciplined as they should have been. The penalties that they took, I think some of them were a little bit lazy and easy tonight. And, I think if you get into that in a game against or in a series against the Tampa Bay Lightning, you're going to get punished. You're going to get, you're going to regret making stupid moves. And, I think of even, the famous Alex Kerfoot, blind drop pass from last year's playoffs. I'm sure you guys remember it. Like, those are the type of things that are just inexcusable. So, for you to have a disciplined team that doesn't make one or two of those decisions, that's the difference in playoff hockey, right? It's one or two decisions per game that teams are going to make you pay for. And I think that's what Keefe and Dubas are most worried about at this stage.
Trade deadline is always a funny subject, and we talked about Boston a couple weeks. I think the last couple weeks actually, in going into the deadline, and obviously being where they're at in the standings, not wanting to go out and make major roster overhaul because the chemistry factor, right? Mm-hmm. And the Leafs being where they were, you had to add some pieces. You need to fill some holes, but do you find that like the Edmonton game and even this game tonight against Vancouver are examples of a team that's trying to build that chemistry back after, adding some major pieces and really shaking up the lineup quite a bit?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, there has to be a recalibration, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. I think with these guys, even the Chicago game, people kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, oh, well, this is just part of the process. And maybe it is, but now you have 19 games left, right? I mean, it's going to be April before you know it. The playoff matchup's pretty clear, I think, unless something drastic changes. So who you're going to be going up against, and that should give you this kind of clear window to figure it out. So I think the schedule isn't terribly onerous on the Leafs necessarily in the next month and a half, but they have to take care of business, right? You don't want to have squandered home ice advantage. I think that would be a terrible look for them mentally and spiritually and in terms of expectations. You'd be going into the playoffs with people's skepticism, probably at a peak for the year, and I think you don't want to do that. Clearly, you want to, to see Samsonov play well. You want to see Murray play well, and to me, the overall look at the team, the lack of consistency, where they don't string together many 5-game win streaks of late. It's usually a couple good games here and then a disastrous game there. One win, one loss. There's just not that collective confidence, I think, that we saw again after that first West Coast road trip early in the season. They looked like they had figured it out and they believed in each other and they were playing smart positionally and patient. And even the Calgary game, I mean, that was a pretty decent game, I think, from their perspective. But to follow it up with a stinker like this has to be worrisome for sure. And, you can certainly see why, fans would be a little bit more pessimistic after a game like tonight.
Yeah, you just mentioned this game too, and even the first West Coast road trip where they were out in California. Obviously, it is a major question for the last few seasons. Why is it that the Maple Leafs play down to their competition? Easy points are, like you said, like the points that are lost are just something that like a bit of a buffer between them and Tampa Bay that could easily extend their lead or even tie them up with Boston right now. But from what you see from watching these games, how do you describe their play, or like why they don't play as well to lower seeded teams compared to they do when they do play Boston, Tampa, New York, and all the teams that are very competitive?
Well, Peter, I think, if you look at the teams that do handle business, it's Boston and Tampa Bay, right? I think I saw a stat come through Twitter tonight that said that I think against sub 500 teams, the Bruins and Tampa Bay are like 10-1-0 or 10-1-2 against those teams. And that's, it almost reminds me of I don't like drawing, comparisons to sports necessarily, but I think back to like when I was a younger guy and the Blue Jays kind of made that jump, in the World Series years where it became businesslike. It wasn't necessarily about being giddy and, we're just happy to be here and look how fancy we are and how talented we are. Those Blue Jays, they brought in Jack Morris and Ricky Henderson and, all these guys to put them over the top, and they never treated anything, even in the playoffs, like it was a big deal until it actually was a big deal. And I think that's true of these Leafs. I mean, sometimes I think they're not businesslike enough to kind of get a little caught up in their own hype. Some of the plays are so beautiful on the ice. You can see why guys, are happy with each other or feeling confident. But that shouldn't take away the need to be, all business, and the need to kind of temper your emotions and not get too high at the best of times and not get too low at the worst of times. And, I think that's what you've seen from this younger team in the past. It's a hallmark of a young team and a team that doesn't have, that experience. And then again, when you see teams like Boston and Tampa Bay, just watch them play. They're not messing around. They might not play the most exciting brand of hockey every night, but they are in it to win it every single game, and they're not messing around. They don't care what your record is. They're intent on playing their own game. And I think until you see that a little bit more consistently in the next few weeks, it's fair to question, whether that's going to be there once the playoffs begin.
The one stat I saw thrown out there, as you mentioned, I think it's pretty clear that the Leafs and Tampa are going to be facing off in the first round once again. Is Vasilevsky's 63 career playoff wins. Ilya Samsonov, one career playoff win, and then Matt Murray, his last playoff win coming back in 2020. You mentioned goaltending. At the beginning of the season, we kind of discussed that, Murray would be the starter, and then it would lead into Samsonov being the starter later in the season. Are we at that point where, there's a pretty clear idea that Samsonov is going to be the guy as the Leafs get into the playoffs?
Oh, for sure. I think so, Andrew. I think he's probably earned the benefit of the doubt. And, that's not to dump on Matt Murray. Again, he came into the game tonight with a lot of pressure on him to deliver, and he made his best save of the season on that, 2-on-1 play. I think he deserves a little bit of credit. And I guess the question for me is just, you can't fault a guy for his body giving out on him, right? It's just, that's what happens to players sometimes, different stages of their careers. I think of a guy like Andrew Hammond, who, was on that goaltending walking wire above like a circus performer. And they can't replicate it for whatever reason, whether half of it's mental, half of it's physical. It really affects what you can do night to night. So I still worry about that from Murray's perspective until he's really healthy for a long stretch. And now there isn't really a long stretch to show it in anymore. They are going to be leaning, I think, on Samsonov for sure. Again, to me, when Kyle Dubas comes out and says, well, we're confident in our guys, we're confident in Joe Woll, that's great. But, what happens when, that first game one comes against Tampa Bay and they get the doors blown off of them, right? I mean, do you go back to Ilya Samsonov again, or do you just dump it and go to Murray? I mean, that's going to be, that a clear talking point. That's going to be a clear media focal point and storyline and narrative, however you want to say it. I think that's why, in my mind, when I talk to some people around the league, they thought it would be important to bring in another guy into that mix. I mean, Keith Kincaid gets traded, to Colorado, a guy that most people wouldn't be able to pick out of a lineup. But it's almost like pitching, right? You can't have enough good goaltending in your lineup. It's good to have that alternative. And I just wonder whether, if it gets to the point where Joseph Woll is the guy, something's probably gone terribly wrong, for the other two guys. And I think if Kyle Dubas has done all this work to rejig the lineup and it still comes down to the decisions and the choices that were made in the summer about goaltending, that might be a problem that eventually sinks Kyle Dubas's shot at staying in this job for the long term.
One final question, or two final questions from me, Adam. Kind of like a two-parter. Could be a short answer, could be a long answer, depending on how you feel about this. Based on the moves that they made, O'Reilly, Achari, McCabe, Lafferty, Schenn, where do you see the Maple Leafs finishing in the playoffs? Do they win a round, 2 rounds, 3, go into the Cup final? And is winning 1 round enough to keep Sheldon Keefe to keep his job, Kyle Dubas to keep his job? Or if they lose, what's the worst case scenario in your opinion?
Well, that's a great question, Peter. I think, for me, I do expect them to win at least 1 round. I think anything less than that would be disastrous, especially if it's a quick exit or an ugly exit, and there are games that, that are blowouts. It's going to depend on exactly how they lose. But, to put this team together again and to double down on the core 4 forwards, they should be at least winning 1 round. I think it's going to be tough for them, to be honest, to get past Tampa and Boston, in 2 series in a row. And I wouldn't expect, especially if Boston gets some of their injured players back in time, Taylor Hall and Nick Foligno, if they can get those guys back, they're going to be very, very tough to beat. But I do think they've got a good shot against Tampa. I think they have a better shot against Tampa than they did last year. And it's going to come down to goaltending. But, as for the keeping the jobs, I think, Brendan Shanahan probably has, more body armor, in his arsenal to kind of protect Kyle Dubas for maybe 1 more year after this one, even if it doesn't go well. I don't think that, who are you going to pull in? You can name some up and coming guys, but the hard choices are still going to be there. I mean, what are you going to do to that core 4 if it doesn't go right for you this year, right? I mean, who are you going to trade? Is it going to be Nylander? I mean, some people would have heart palpitations, and rightfully so, right? Because his game has been elevated too. This year, you can't trade John Tavares. You're never going to trade Matthew. You're never going to trade Marner. So what do you do except run it back again, right? I mean, that may sound frustrating, but if you look at the way some teams have developed in the past, there's been a lot of heartache, that came before the good times. Colorado's a good example. There wasn't that long ago that Nathan McKinnon sounded like a guy that couldn't take much more losing if they tried, and that Ryan O'Reilly was once a part of what they thought was their future, right? So, I think to answer your question as fast as I can, Pierre, it's
all good.
It feels like to me that it's still going to be a team that, is a good regular season team next year, no matter what happens. And the frustrating part is it's going to always come back to the playoffs. So if they don't get it done, I think they're capable of a longer run? Yeah, for sure. If any team, if they have health and a hot streak and their special teams are good and they're disciplined, I think you can make the argument for quite a few teams having a deep run, and Toronto's one of them. But, I do think there's that danger there clearly of just running into a kind of generational buzzsaw, that is the Lightning and that is the Bruins. They both of those teams have players that are signed to great deals and players that, returned on very cheap contracts that allowed them to build, great rosters. And Toronto probably doesn't have that luxury because nobody's thinking, Austin Matthews is going to give them a $5 million per year contract so he can be more competitive. He's still going to get paid. Marner's still going to get paid. Nylander's going to get a raise. They're going to be desperate for the cap to go up to really try and improve the group. So I think that's where the pressure comes in for me. It's those core guys that are really going to have to do the heavy lifting, and that's probably as it should be.
Dubas made the necessary moves in order to try and prove that the core four can get the job done in the playoffs, to surround him with the depth and pieces needed. Adam, thank you for joining us to talk about the trade deadline, playoff implications, and everything about the Toronto Maple Leafs. Before you head on out, where can the listeners find you on social media, your work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to. The more I look at the screen here, I'm apologizing for the lighting in advance, guys. I'm not a vampire.
It's all good.
I'm not a vampire. It's just bad lighting wherever I'm sitting. No, I'm at the Hockey News for the most part, writing almost every day, and I write a Leafs column for the Full Press website. And my Twitter handle is Prototype. That's where I do most of my social media stuff. I have a Facebook. It's really just a personal Facebook, but Twitter's where I like to be. I think Twitter's still fun. You know, people can talk about the misery of Twitter, and I think it's all what you make of it, right? It's if you want to be a dick about things, it's going to show through. If you want to be, open to new ideas and analytics and just appreciating the game from different perspectives, I think that's been great, and it's great to see young guys like you guys, being out there for people and having a platform to give your impressions on the game, because I still remember being a young guy at the Hockey News and going in, and I was so intimidated when I first began. Right, I was like, I went to the boss, Steve Dryden, at the time, and said, Steve, I feel intimidated by these guys, right? Mike Brophy and Mark Brender was the old writer at the time, and I said, I don't really feel confident, talking about my perspective. I don't feel like I know as much as they do. And Steve just said, Adam, they don't know shit about hockey either. So we're all in this together. And I always like to encourage young guys to keep moving forward and doing what you're doing, because that kind of, it shows your appreciation for the game. and even if you're a born and raised Toronto guy, I still think it's possible to cover the game and cover the Leafs, with perspective and with just a cold-blooded kind of lowdown of what you see in them, without having to be a fan necessarily. It's good to be a fan. We're all fans of the game in one way or another. But, I think I said this to many people that, when you get in this business for a long time, you cheer for people, not necessarily for teams. Mm-hmm. And, there's every team that wins every year. There are great stories, personal stories, redemption, overcoming odds, all that stuff. And there's no shortage of that in Toronto either. But I thank you guys for the time, and hope to talk to you again.
Appreciate it, Adam. Thank you very much for coming on with us.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. So much. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Well, as we mentioned, that interview was brought to you by the fine folks at Indy Ale House. Great word from our sponsors right now. Hockey is back, and with it, so are our Maple Leafs. Getting ready for a night out or watching the game at home with the gang? What better way to do it than with a nice cold one from the folks at Indy Ale House in Toronto? With 2 locations in the city, at Italy, Toronto, at Bay and Bloor, the Beerteca location. They have 2 big screens, amazing authentic Italian food, and loads of beer. Also at OG Brew Pub in the Junction and Kiel at Dundas. With 120 seats, famous bar food, and 12 taps, Indy Ale House is an award-winning brewery featuring their flagship Instigator IPA and dozens of rotating monthly special release beers. Perfect for takeout, dine-in, or bottle shop online orders when planning for game night. You can find Instigator IPA and Marco Polo Pilsner at finer LCBOs across the province as well. Hashtag Live Indy is the motto. Adventurous, fun-focused beers with a selection for everyone, from a healthy dose of in-your-face hoppy beers for the beer geeks to mainstream pilsners and easy drinking options. Indy Ale House is the go-to for game day. Visit www.indyalehouse.com to place your order today. Well, Peter, great interview. So glad we got Adam on here. A lot of insight, and obviously, as he mentioned at the end there, he's been around the game for some time, and same as us. Like we obviously fans of the Maple Leafs, but at the same time, fans of the game, and to cover it from an outside perspective, sometimes we do get called homers, especially having a podcast like this, Sticks in the Six. But there are times where, it's nice to take a step back and cover it from an outside perspective and cover the team without, with a little bit of objectivity as well. So thanks again to Adam for joining us tonight, and appreciate the insight on the Leafs trade deadline. as we mentioned, there is a little bit more Leaf talk to have before we close it out here. Start off with let's start off with your thoughts on the overall grades for the Leafs from the trade deadline, acquiring McCabe, Lafferty, you name it.
Does that include the results of the game against the Canucks?
Forget the results of the game against the Canucks.
Yeah, screw the results. Overall, you can't help but give this team an A for addressing the potential needs and matching up what the competition is going to be like, because Boston is a hard, heavy hitting team. Tampa Bay is a hard, heavy hitting team that plays a highly skilled offensive game, just like the Maple Leafs. Toronto got in a smart centerman, got some depth with Achari. They brought in 2 bruising defenders that can play a shutdown role in McCabe and Schenn. Again, there was going to be a lot of talk about whether Kyle Dubas is going to go all in at the deadline, and he made a statement with the O'Reilly trade. Then Boston answered, getting Orlov, Tampa Bay with Jeannot. But then again, there was word that the deal with Chicago was already in the works before the Jeannot deal was already done. So he was already planning this in advance, knowing that, he didn't necessarily think that something was going to go down, but made it in the sense that he gave his team security, in the sense that, hey, we're going to be going up against Tampa. We're going up against Boston. We need to match fire with fire, that intensity with intensity. And he got that with every single player that he wanted to get. Obviously, there's some question marks with, honestly, everyone was sort of kind of not necessarily complaining about the Engvall deal, but I could see why they moved on from him because of his inconsistency in the playoffs and his inability to use the size to his advantage. Sandin, we talked about it with Adam, how he was further down the depth chart, wasn't getting that opportunity, and you got that first round back. Whether that's going to be, late 30 to 32, higher up, we don't know what's going to happen in the playoffs. That Boston pick can move higher up, but you got that first round pick back, and that's going to be important considering that you moved all this draft capital and you got some back in return. That is huge, asset management from Dubas's part. And yeah, people are going to say, hey, yeah, he made too many moves. It's going to mess with the team chemistry. But at the same time, he made the necessary moves to make this team competitive and push them over the top. So that is why I'm giving them an A. And especially with the play of McCabe and Schenn, I'm really, really excited that that physicality and edge is back, but they're very smart in how they're going about their hitting and not getting out of position. That to me is very huge.
I'm going to give him a B+, and the reason being is that just having that conversation with Adam on this episode here, I think Dubas addressed what he needed to address, and the chemistry I'm not worried about. The loss against Edmonton, the loss against Vancouver, it's not something that's bothering me right now because we do have 19 games left. And from that aspect too, I think he made those bigger moves to make the changes within the lineup ahead of the deadline. Yeah, it might have only been 2 or 3 days ahead of the deadline, but regardless, he did it ahead of the deadline and kind of put the rest of the team at ease. Engvall, I mean, he did have to go, and that's not a knock on his game. I just think there wasn't a place for him to fit in terms of what you needed to find that next level in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. You mentioned he doesn't use his size the way that you'd want him to. His offense was kind of coming along a little bit more, but he just wasn't the guy that they needed. In terms of Sandin, yeah, I mean, obviously sad to see him go. He's a prospect that the Leafs drafted and developed and brought up through their system. But they did get that first round pick back, and whether it's first, whether it's 32nd in this year's draft, that's a very, very, very important pick to have. And yeah, I think the one thing that I would have liked to see is, as Adam mentioned, maybe pick up a tertiary goaltending option in like a James Reimer or a Keith Kincaid, or
kind of like they did with Riddick 2 years back.
Yeah, even an Anthony Stolarz or something like that. Like, give us an option that you see these guys go down. You have somebody with a little bit more NHL experience than Joseph Woll, and it's not a knock on Woll because what he's had a hell of a season so far. He's played well in the opportunities that he's been given with the big club. It's just saying, like, it's playoff. We're going to the playoffs. You can't have a guy who's got 10 games of NHL experience coming up and being your starting goalie come the playoffs. That being said, there are stories where, you've had a guy like that come up and have a hell of a run. I just don't think, knowing what we know about the Maple Leafs over the past number of years, that's not a storyline that seems to fit in with the Maple Leafs. So I hope Samsonov can get the job done. I hope that if he can't, that Murray's right there. And we've seen Murray step in late in playoffs before. Regardless, I give him a B+ because I think that's the one spot that they could have maybe really just put this thing away and really won the NHL trade deadline this season. But all things considered, they got some depth on the back end. They brought in a guy with years left on his contract in Jake McCabe and at a great price. Luke Schenn, I mean, the excitement that you saw on Luke Schenn's face to be back in Toronto and to get his number 2 and I mean the hits tonight that he laid in the Vancouver game to get that game going. I mean,
passion.
He certainly has the passion. And like I said, I don't know if that's how loud his hits actually are, or if that's just the echo in the barn of disappointment in Vancouver. But I'm excited to see what Luke Schenn can add to this playoff lineup. And then obviously, hopefully, as you can see on our ticker there, that Ryan O'Reilly left tonight's game with a hand injury, didn't play any time in the third. Let's hope that if it is a break, that it's maybe something that either one he can play with, or that maybe he can get healed up pretty quickly. Otherwise, we're talking about another Foligno deal that goes awry for the Leafs heading into the playoffs. But all around, I think the Leafs did what they needed to do. I think Dubas did what he needed to do, and I think the chemistry is going to come. I just give it time. We've got 19 games left. Give it time, and you'll see this team really turn things around. But yeah,
just to jump in about O'Reilly. A lot of main of the beat reporters are saying that Keefe says that O'Reilly will have a follow-up on O'Reilly on Monday at practice. So definitely probably going for x-rays, MRIs, and then we'll probably have an answer then, but does not sound very encouraging.
Yeah. So, I mean, given that, I mean, you still have a month before you're heading into the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you need to rest him now, if you need to sit him down and let him kind of bounce back, now's the time to do it. But I don't know. I don't know. Not the news you wanted to have coming out of this, but aside from that, anything that you kind of wanted to talk about before we close out this episode, Peter?
Not necessarily. I do want to share a great Luke Schenn story. Because I remember back when he was drafted, I was in high school and I was really happy to see him play. The junior hockey at that level, winning gold with Team Canada. Was really excited when the Maple Leafs drafted him. I thought he was the player that they kind of needed, big, heavy, physical defenseman. Obviously, I thought, he's going to be the best defenseman ever. But then again, that's before, understanding the game and everything like that as a young high schooler or whatever. But about a year or two later, obviously, Schenn had a good rookie season, but then he started to fall out because the Maple Leafs, it kind of looked like they were trying to rush him and everything like that. And obviously, that's a bad mistake when you're developing a prospect. And management, player development was not great back then. So I was in high school, finished exams, went to a mall, and I was walking around with my family because we were out there celebrating because it was my last one. And I see a guy at the food court. His head was down. He's wearing a hat. And from the look at his face, I'm like, oh my God, that looks like Luke Schenn. So me being this 15, 16-year-old kid, I'm like, I knew the season that he had, and he got a lot of criticism from the media and everything like that. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go up to him and I'm going to ask him. I go up to him. I'm like, hi, are you Luke Schenn? And he looks up and he's just like, yeah, I'm Luke Schenn. And I'm like, listen, you had a fantastic season. I just wanted to wish you the best of luck and really hope that you pull through and do great next season. And he had the biggest smile on his face because you could tell that he was probably dealing with a lot of that, wasn't talked about it back then, but a lot of mental health aspects, the psychological aspects, the doubt and everything like that as a young player coming into this kind of franchise. And he literally just responded to me, appreciate it, man. Thanks. And I just let him go off. And obviously didn't quite work out. He was traded for James Van Riemsdyk. Van Riemsdyk worked out, but then Schenn started to find his footing later on throughout his career. And I'm so glad that he's back. It came full circle because I was a big fan of Luke Schenn then, throughout his career, and even right now. So I just wanted to share that little Luke Schenn story about a high schooler, me not being all fan crazy or whatever, about meeting an NHLer at a mall. But yeah, just a little fun story to just kind of brighten your day. And even so, like, just wanted to boost his spirits kind of thing, because he really needed it at that time.
So what you're saying is you want to get Luke Schenn on the podcast now that his career's come full circle and he's back in Toronto.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
No, I'm glad you actually brought that up, because it's very much the same idea that I had when I wrote that piece about Justin Hall being used in a Jake Gardiner situation in Toronto.
Yeah.
The same thing, and we talked about when we had Jay Rosehill on the show. We talked about the expectations that were placed on Luke Schenn's shoulders when he was this 18-year-old kid drafted to the mecca of hockey in Toronto, and he was suddenly the face of the franchise. He had that truculence that Brian Burke wanted, and he was placed in this
tenacity,
this role of and these expectations that weren't realistic, right? Like Luke Schenn was never going to be your number one defenseman.
Yeah.
He and that's why, like, over his career, you've seen him kind of find his way and find his place and understand what his role is and what's interesting about it is that when he came up, it was a league that needed tenacity, needed truculence, needed toughness. Now you're in a league where it's about skill and speed, and somehow a guy who has most certainly lost a step still is excelling in the role that he's placed in. And he's a 5'6". He's a 5'6". Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's a 5'6". He's your stay-at-home. He's your Jake Muzzin type of defenseman. And he has a booming shot still from the point. I don't know if you saw it tonight in Vancouver.
Oh, yeah.
But, hell of a shot. And then to see him come back and to see him get that opportunity to wear the Leaf again and have his career come full circle. Those are the stories that Adam's talking about when he talks about, covering the game and covering the people and cheering for people rather than teams. And you really do get to that point, because I think, even had Luke Schenn not come back to Toronto to close out his career, as a two-time Stanley Cup champion with the Tampa Bay Lightning, I mean, that's a hell of a story, seeing how it's all started out. So.
And I also like Dewis's comment about Schenn, how there was a possibility of him coming back when he won the Cups with Tampa, but they didn't have that depth role available. And then now all of a sudden we have it, although I probably would have made room for him in order to bring him in anyways, because his heart was set on coming to Toronto. I can't remember where I saw that, but I did see that online where they did want to bring him in. They just couldn't make it work at that time. But now it worked, and finally things fell into place.
Yeah, no, it was such a great story, and like I said, I'm glad you brought that up to kind of close out the show. As always, it's been a hell of a week, a hell of a show, and everybody out there, in Ontario that's getting hit with walloped with the snow, stay safe.
Exactly.
Bend your knees when you're shoveling if you don't have a snow blower.
Exactly.
But before we close it out, I know Josh, longtime listener, has been tuning in all episodes, so. Shout out to Josh. Great guest. So thank you again to Adam for coming on, Adam Proteau from the Hockey News. Keep up the hard work and go Leafs go. Tough one tonight, Josh, but we'll definitely like to see the Leafs bounce back when it's all said and done. As always, for me, Andrew Forbes, you can follow me on Twitter at Andrew G. Forbes. You can follow Peter at P. Baracchini. You can follow Alex, who wasn't here tonight, at A. Hobson Media. Or you can follow the show at Sticks in the Six. You'll see if you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe. You can also see us down at the bottom there, Sticks in the Six, STIXINTHE 6IXPOD. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, hit subscribe on YouTube. Make sure you check out all of our socials. Or you can tune in tomorrow when we get this episode up on all the streaming networks as well. Otherwise, shout out to Adam Proteau for joining us tonight. Shout out to the Indie Ale House for continuing to sponsor this wonderful show. And shout out to the Variety Sports Network for giving us the opportunity to be part of this wonderful, wonderful podcast network. Until next week, episode 116 of Sticks in the Six. Have a good night, folks.